Hello, everybody. My name is Conor Bracken. I'm an assistant poetry editor at FWR Review, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this conversation with these three lovely, illustrious poets. Today, we're going to be talking about chapbooks and full lengths and the connection between them. How do we make a chapbook into a full length? How has that happened for us kind of as individuals? And hopefully how that might help you think about doing the same thing if that's something you're interested in. So with me today, we have Taneum Bambrick, we have Tiana Clark, and Ananda Lima, as you can see. It's really wonderful that they could take the time to sit down with me remotely and have this conversation. But I thought before we have this conversation, we could let them kind of introduce themselves and give a brief introduction as to, why they're qualified and why they're wonderful. So we'll start with you, Taneum.
Okay, thank you so much, Connor. Thanks for hosting us. I'm so excited to be here with Tiana and Ananda, whose work I admire so much. And so my name is Taneum Bambrick, and I won the Yamasi Chapbook Prize in 2017, which totally changed my life and was an amazing experience. And I think definitely paved the way for me to have a first book published. So my first book, Vantage, came out through the American Poetry Review in 2019. That's me.
Yay. I'm Tiana Clark. Again, like Taneum, I'm just so excited to be here with Taneum and Ananda and Connor. Thanks for having us, Connor, and curating this discussion. I think this is a really important discussion and something that actually doesn't get talked about often. And it's always that, like, what come first, the chicken or the egg? Chapbook, book, first book, and having those kind of conversations and the dilation that happens between them, I think will be a really cool convo today. So I won the Frost Place Chapbook competition in 2016. Tatum, when you started listing dates, I was like, now it's getting to the point now, I'm like, wait, what year is it? What's happened? What is time anymore? Yeah, it's 2016. And so that working with Ross at Bull City Press was such an amazing experience for me and definitely paved the way for my first full-length collection, I Can't Talk About the Trees Without the Blood, which won the Agnes Lynch Sterrett Prize with the University of Pittsburgh Press. So that's me, and yeah, I'm excited to be here. So I'm not crying. I mean, maybe I am, but I think it's actually dry eyes. So if you see me weeping, which is weird because you think dry eyes, you're not gonna, it's actually, you have dry eyes and your eyes weep. So if you see me just weeping a lot, that's what's happening. I'm sorry.
Oh my gosh, that has happened to me so many times at very weird times, like at conferences and stuff. I'm not crying. So I'm Ananda Lima, and I wrote this chapbook translation, and it won the Villa Prize, and it's with Paper Nautilus. And this chapbook in 2019, this chapbook led to my full length that is coming out in the fall, Motherland. So that's fun. So that's one. And I'm also the author of this chapbook, Amblyopia, that just came out with Bull City Press. Also worked with Ross, and all the people there are so amazing. And this is currently sort of turning into a full collection that will come whenever, because it's really much in progress. I also have a fiction chapbook, Tropicalia, that is coming out in May. That on the fiction side, I'm also working on expanding. So this topic is really fun for me, and I'm very happy to be here with all these people who I love and whose work is just amazing. Thank you.
It's so great to have all of you. And I guess I'll say, like, I'm also somewhat qualified, though it's really kind of intimidating in a great way to be among such great poets with such incredible publication firepower and poetic brilliance. But I also won the Frost Place Chapbook Prize, I think 2017. So I must have been after you, Tiana, and I got to work with Ross on my chapbook, Henry Kissinger Mon Amour, which it took a lot of time to turn into my full length, The Enemy of My Enemy Is Me, which is forthcoming in June 2021 with Diode Editions Press. But so, yeah, I mean, give it up for just how amazing all of y'all are and how incredible your books are. For those of you watching, if you have not read their work or their books, massive recommendations and encouragements to get them, because they are beautiful and there's so much to be learned from every single one of the poems and their combination, which is the thing we'll probably talk about a little bit today. But so we all kind of thought about a variety of different questions before we got here, but the hope is that we're going to start off with a specific one and kind of move into conversation however it goes. And the question that I thought we could start kind of answering, and Taneum will start us off as last time, is thinking about audience expectations. And audience expectations are quite different from the chapbook to the full length. And I'm curious to hear all of y'all speak about, kind of how you think about those differences. How have you metaphorized or dramatized those? And then how, in these translations, these transmutations, have you accommodated or tried to disrupt them, kind of whatever it is. So yeah, Taneum, if you want to get started, give us a thought of that.
This question was the hardest, I think, for me to think through, because I don't know if I really know what audience expectations are for a chapbook or for a full-length book. I think that definitely with a chapbook, I wrote this book as my MFA thesis, and I basically submitted the part of it that felt done, and that part of it maybe was more traditional, like less hybrid, less experimental. And I think that in that way, I was sort of I was unable to publish the poems individually, because I think my book is very much a narrative, and so if you extract like individual parts, they don't really make sense. And I was encouraged by my workshop leaders at the University of Arizona to pursue like chapbook publication, because they were like, well, don't be discouraged that these individual poems aren't placing. And so I guess I wasn't really thinking about audience. I was thinking about how to gain, and I was trying to think about how to even get my my project into like anyone's hands at all, because I was worried that you had to have each poem published before it would be taken as a book, but that wasn't happening for me. Does that make sense? So it was sort of like, I wasn't really thinking about audience. And then after I wrote it, I found that I did like a mini chapbook tour, which was sort of where I learned the like professional components of how to talk about your book and the language and the world of the book. And also, so I was reading at mostly bars in random places, and sometimes bookstores. And I was just writing down questions people had for me when I would read. So I would hear sort of like where the gaps were. And I don't mean gaps in a bad way, but like places where I was resisting something that felt risky, or where I hadn't written yet something that might be the most vulnerable thing. And so, yes, I think that my book felt a lot more risky. Like I think I learned to trust audience more through the process of touring the chapbook. That's the end of my answer.
That's great. Thank you, Taneum.
Yeah.
Tiana, yeah,
Yeah. First of all, I've never heard the word. Did you say metaphorize? How did you say that?
Sometimes I just make these things up.
I know that's what we do as poets. I love that.
I mean, I'm sure. I think I've probably heard it before, but yeah, metaphorize.
Yeah, I want to steal that. I like that. I really appreciate this question, but I kind of like Taneum. I often don't think about audience kind of in general. Like even on a micro level, one thing I saw Terrence Hayes in an interview talk about how during his first drafts, he was like, the audience is never in the room. It's just me and my shadows. And I'm just exercising everything out. And obviously we all think about audience at some point. And I think for me, that comes in with like revision, right? Or when you are thinking about publication. And I always tell my students, like, there's the poems that you write and the poems that you publish. So obviously audience comes in somewhere later on the line. But for me, I think I kind of stumbled into the book publication process. And I felt like I had, 15, 20 poems in conversation. I wasn't ready for like the big book yet. I know some people are kind of come with that kind of a theme or a strong tone for like a bigger book or a project book. And then sometimes they work backwards for the chapbook. But for me, the chapbook, and not to diminish the chapbook, but it very much felt like the training wheels process, like that maturation process of like, I'm ready for the tyke bike with the extra wheels. And I was like, aesthetics are extremely important to me. And I started, and I tell my students to when you're thinking about publishing, start picking up journals, start reading your favorite magazines, start taking notes on each one of what, is it print, is it online, is it both, what kind of poems are they publishing, what do you like? And when I saw Frost Place in the Bull City Press, I remember at AWP, also that's a great time to go look at these tables and touch these books. And I was really impressed with Bull City because they actually felt like books. And I could tell that not only were the poems amazing, but actually the actual artifact, the product had some heft and it was beautiful. And I knew Anders Carlson because he went to Vanderbilt. And so when his book came out, I'm trying to think of the name. Doesn't even know it. You guys know it. Wait.
Dynamite.
Yeah, thank you. I'm like, my friend Anders, I can't remember the name of his book. I was like, oh, this book feels so good. And like so many of us, I feel like, again, it's that kind of rite of passage. I was just like, I think I have 15, 20 poems in conversation. Let me submit to a chapbook competition. I make it sound so haphazard, but that's kind of how I was. And it was during my first year of my MFA, and I think I looked at submitting during that time as a way to kind of, deadlines were a way also for me to like help in my revision process. Like I didn't even think of, oh man, of course you have that secret desire, I hope I get it. But it was, I think that does something very magical to the universe and to your poems when you start kind of subconsciously saying, I think this might be ready, or you start coalescing and pushing things in conversation. And so I think that's what kind of pushed that I've now have forgotten the question and I've gone on another journey, but that was like my chapbook journey with that. And when I got to the big book, I remember thinking, okay, I know that you're allowed to use poems from your chapbook and your big book, and that felt, I was like, oh, that feels comfortable, because that can also be scary in your chapbook. You're like, can I repeat these poems? I did think about audience in that way, Conor, of like, did I want to, what if I was going to repeat it, was there a certain reason why? But when it got to the big book for me, I definitely had like a theme, and I definitely, and I'll get this into this later, but after I had gone the chapbook route, I was like, oh, I've done the chapbook, kind of like Tatum, like after you do the little mini tour, you get a little amuse-bouche of what's happening, then it kind of helps you for the big book. Because I was like, well, what conversations do I want to be having and have to answer in the Q&As and the interviews? I kind of got a mini taste of that with the chapbook. And so when it broke down my book and that title, it kind of became a triptych for me. And I was like, well, I've written chapbook before, let me just do 3 chapbooks. And that's how I looked at each of the sections of my big book as actually 3 different chapbooks. And that helped me kind of break down the aerial view into like sizable chunks to help me kind of manage it mentally and emotionally. And so again, I've lost the thread of the question, and I'm sure I'll be repeating several times, and I feel like I've I've talked for a long time, and so I'm going to stop and let's go to Ananda and her beautiful colored books. Thank you.
That was so great. Like it was great. Wherever you went. And I'm about to do something like that, the same thing. But audience. Okay. When I heard this question, I was like, I didn't think of the audience as audience, but I did have this question framed in a different way that I think ends up resulting in a similar thing as thinking of the audience, which is I always thought of what kind of thing is this, so it wasn't like I thought, oh, a chapbook has these expectations. It was more, I'm writing these poems, and then I see that there's a sort of theme emerging, and there's a lot of poems that are talking to each other, and they're tending towards a sort of a subject matter or a mood. And at first, I don't know. First, I'm thinking of the poem as a poem, and then I'm thinking this blob is with both of my books, right? I went backwards, like Tiana mentioned that some people do. I first thought of the thing as a book. I'm like, okay, this is my book, the blob. It's gonna be the book somehow. And then the chapbook came later. I'm like, no. What I'm doing right now is this. So it wasn't so much as, oh, this is a chapbook, therefore that's the expectation. It was more like, oh, this is the kind of object that I'm working on right now. Now, what kind of object? I think it was a matter of density. So it's a sort of more dense approach and more focused. And the other poems, they're sprawling out. They were connected, but they weren't really part of this conversation. So I think that's how the expectations came in. It was more the expectation of that object versus the expectation of the audience. And I say this not to say like, I don't think about the audience. It's not that. It's just that I was very far from that when I was working on it. It takes a while to place these things. By the time I had this as a chapbook, I wasn't yet this stuff wasn't in my orbit, you know. But I think for me, the difference between the blob and the and the chapbook was just that there was a conversation sort of crystallizing along this nucleus, and the other things, they could have sort of talked to it, but it just sort of instead of adding to it, when I added the stuff outside of it, it was making it not as good. So I understood that it was a smaller conversation, a smaller size. I hope that answers it somehow.
I mean, I
Sidebar,
think
I say all books should be called blobs now, just by the way.
second the motion.
Amazing.
I love that. I mean, there's so many wonderful things that y'all have said that make me think of my responses to some of these questions as well. But I guess the first thing that I really love is that you're like thinking about the audience itself in the process of composition and even assemblage can be paralyzing, right? And I mean, especially in the earlier moments of composing a poem or conceiving of how you might be kind of crystallizing this particular conversation, as you called it, Ananda. And then I love, what you're saying, Taneum, about bringing it out into the world. And, you've probably, like we all have, just looked at this object so many times over and over and over again. You can recite it in your sleep, but then all of these audience members are coming up and reciting these different kind of gaps that maybe you were aware of or were avoiding. And so though the audience wasn't part of the initial process, they were part of the kind of expansion process in some ways into that larger, kind of more complex set of conversations, which T, when you're talking about like the 3 different chapbooks as a way of like conceiving of a full collection. I don't know about y'all, but I spent so much time just like reordering things and trying to figure out their internal consistencies. And that thought of like 3 different chapbooks together somehow seems like a really helpful kind of heuristic or mnemonic for doing that. So that's super cool. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that you were saying too, Tiana, about how Terrence Hayes talks about like him and his shadows when he's like writing a poem initially, reminded me of this John Cage quote that might be apocryphal, but I heard recently that's kind of about the process of creating a work of art is so that people start leaving the room, right? Because when you start, it's you and everybody else around you. And as you get deeper into the actual creation, your parents leave and like the larger society leaves. And eventually, if you do it well enough, even you leave. And so in some ways, I'm saying the question I asked her was crap, because it's not always about audience in some ways, right? But so one of the things I'm interested in, because it sounds like based on some of your responses and what I know, a lot of y'all started with the chapbook and felt more comfortable about that. And then that kind of parlayed itself into the larger full length book as blob, 3 chapbooks in a trench coat, whatever we want to call it. I'd be interested to hear what y'all felt like maybe it allowed you to do more of, and like maybe what you had to sacrifice from the initial chapbook in order to kind of get to where you felt like the full length was working and you could leave that chapbook behind. Because like the anxiety you were talking about, Tiana, right? Like, can I repeat these poems? Like, do people want to see them again? Like maybe when that went away in some ways.
Yeah.
So I don't know, Taneum, if we want to start off with you, or if anybody wants to take it.
I totally don't mind starting off. Is that what you want me to do? I can do it. Okay. I was going to say that I think for me, the biggest difference between, so I actually had a conversation with Ross about this at Bread Loaf. We sat on like, there's a little white barn there where they have, it's like a theater, I think now is what they use it for. We were sitting on the porch there and talking about that, and I was telling him sort of like my fears about having too many of the same poems in the chapbook and in the full length, and worrying about audience in that way and trying to figure out how to make them different. And I ended up I think all the poems that are in my chapbook are in my full length. So that felt like a really big risk. And I think that there are some people who do that and some people who say like never ever do that. And so I'm interested in what you all think about that too. For me, I think that my chapbook had a quieter reception, so it didn't really matter that much. But the biggest difference is that I was really interested in hybridity and including essays alongside poems, but I I don't think I really knew that was what I was interested in until a workshop with the poet Amber Flora Thomas. Do you know her work? I'm like obsessed. I love her work so much. But I brought in this sort of like a prose fragment that was what became the essay Sturgeon that's in my book. That's like pretty long, and I felt really nervous to put that in my book. But I had only this one section from it about my dad. That was this image where this is kind of sad, but when my sister and I were little, he got angry at us and like tried to throw a couch, and the wheel of the couch broke off the bottom. And I went to visit him to interview him because he's a biologist, to ask him some questions about this fish that lived in the river where I worked. And while we were talking, he like told me that he kept the wheel that broke off of the couch in his office desk. So he would like look at it every day and remember that he did that. And I always thought about how complicated that was. And, but I barely wrote about it. And Amber saw that, and Amber Flora saw that. And she was like, what is this? Like, this is something that's missing from your book. And so I think that for me, the scariest thing is to write about my relationship with my father and how that's interconnected with a lot of other concerns I have, about like just self-discovery in terms of like, especially being queer in a rural space, being, working with men that in a place where my father also worked. It's just a very complicated, interconnected kind of thing. And so I think that the difference between my chapbook and my book is just like pretty much the risk of hybridity and the risk of engaging in those sort of like traumatic, scarier, more personal details. I'm also forgetting what your question was. I feel like as I'm talking about this, but yeah, that was the biggest difference for me. And yeah, I think, can you remind me all the parts of that question again so I can make sure I answered it?
Well, I mean, I think if we think of the question as like, what helped you move from chapbook into full length?
Okay,
And
yes.
like embracing hybridity and embracing the risk and complexity of those conversations. I mean, that sounds like a really great and difficult authorization to find.
Yeah. And I think that like having good teachers is really important for that. And I think that, like Amber Flora read a huge chunk of this project, didn't like have to do that. That wasn't required of her. And so I think that was important to sort of have someone help me identify what I was avoiding, I guess. That was helpful. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, it was so great, Tana. It was so interesting to go after you because I kind of had a different, almost like a polar opposite experience for me a little bit. And that I'm trying to, I find myself wanting to qualify or be careful how I say it, but I'm like, you know what, Tiana, be proud of yourself and just say the damn thing. And that's, my chapbook did really well. And it kind of became its own book. And so my pressure for me was that since it had a big reception, I was like you, Taneum, I was worried that everyone had kind of read some of these poems, and then because it felt more like a book than a chapbook to me, I kind of let go of like, this is its own thing. And the full length kind of became a challenge of like, I'm creating a newer object, and I want them to kind of have two separate worlds. I think I only have 2.5 poems because I think I like took a section out of one of my poems in the chapbook. In the big book, like 2 poems that I was like, what are poems in here that absolutely are in this other conversation? But I kind of gave myself the permission to let my chapbook be its own thing, and just kind of like put it on a boat and push it away. And I know for the chapbook, a kind of guiding principle for me, Charles Baxter was visiting Vanderbilt at the time. And I always say this too, if you're in your MFA, take advantage of these people that are coming in. And when you're working on your chapbook or working in the big book, bring those questions to those Q&As. Like, don't look at those writers and blink your eyes. And I asked him, I said, hey, I'm putting together a chapbook. And I love people that are poets and novelists. And I said, what are some guiding principles? And he said, I think every good book, whether that's a novel, a linked short story collection, or a sequence of poems, starts with an unanswerable question. And the protagonist or the story links struggles with that, try to answer that question. It never does, but it's that tension that creates the narrative arc. And I was like, yes. And because I was working on Equilibrium at the time, and the titular poem ends with a question, which my workshop grilled me about and said poems shouldn't end with questions, blah, 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 which is another thing. The workshop is a voice, but not the voice. And if I paid attention to everything in my workshop and that sanitizes risk, I would not be where I am today. Side adjacent point, find your trusted readers in your workshop though. They're there. Okay, pedestal off. But when he said that, my book, that chapbook kind of unfolded for me, and that every poem was going to be answering that question of identity for me and that particular book. And so that became very solid in that book. And so I think every book has that unanswerable question, or that a theme, or maybe it's a lyric mode or whatever. But so Equilibrium again was so a tightly lidded kind of box to me, answering that question of identity. In that book, which was like, what happens when we stop trying to become the other? So those questions were wrestling with that space and that liminality. So when I got to the big book, it was more of that challenge of I'm kind of creating this newer, bigger project. What is this? And for me, I was definitely haunted by different people. And so Nina Simone was kind of haunting me while I was writing the bigger book. As well as like Phyllis Wheatley and, you know, some other people. And so I kind of let those voices haunt me in a different way. And I challenged myself to write like something a little bit different.
That was awesome. I love the unanswerable question thing. There's so many things here that I'm like, I'm gonna like write this down and just have it by me because it's really helpful to think and remember. So yeah, for me, there are some things in common, but some things different. So because as a writer and as a person, just bringing back the blob, my challenge usually is that I'm very sprawling and blobular, and like, as you can see, just by the way I talk, I go on, and it's like I just create this mass of stuff that is, you know, not super solid. So the chapbook helped me so much with the book. I thought I had the book first, so I'm working with this very sprawling thing, and it was so difficult. And I think just thinking of the blob again, if you think of like, you know, that cells, like when cells sort of not eat a thing outside, but sort of create an inner circle and expel something. But you know, what do you call that thing? Endocytosis, I think. Anyways, so this little nucleus started forming in the blob, right? And that became the chapbook. And that helped me sort of center around a specific object and a specific line of thought. And that became like sort of a guiding principle. So it helped me both by having a core, like a concrete thing that I could work around. And it also helped me when I was eliminating all the stuff that didn't belong to it. So because I'm coming from the big to the small again, I was like, okay, this one, I thought before that it belonged to this chapel, like to this unit, because they're related in this way, but it's outside of it because of X, Y, and Z. So in the process of carving out the chapbook, I thought a lot about the other poems and what other themes are there and how are they related or not related to the chapbook. So the process of putting the chapbook together was very much a lot of the heavy lifting of writing the full length was done in the chapbook process. So I think it's a very helpful thing for people who have this problem that I have. So that was one thing. Yeah, so the other thing that helps is just sort of, if it's your first, like the chapbook was the first book, just individual poem thing that I published, is just to feel like, wow, it's a thing that I did, and that has a lot of value too. Like, it's like, okay, no, I can do something else, I can grow on this. So I think it helps both of in a sort of psychology way, but also in the process of carving out the full length. Is that the whole question? How the chapbook helped the full?
You know, who cares about my questions? These answers are incredible. So I don't know what I'm asking. I'm just so happy to hear what all of you are saying. And I think what's really fascinating is that it seems like we've all had such very different experiences when it comes to kind of generating the chapbook and how it is related to the full length later on. Like Tatum, in some ways, it was what you felt most confident about and what allowed you to kind of scrutinize the risk that you needed to take to move to the next level. Tiana, it sounds like it kind of helped you focus on what your unanswerable question was and move into the next one and figure out which are the voices that you're being haunted by that you want to kind of listen to and be informed by. And then Ananda, it's like how you can focus what you're already working on, separate and then bring it back so that it can then make it kind of more crystal, or like the connection is going to be a bit clearer. Mine was even a little bit more different. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Connor.
I mean, I think I'd rather hear you talk, T.
No. I was just saying I wanted to add an adjacent point to Ananda's point, but I want to hear about your process first.
Sure, I'll try to be brief. But so I was working on this full length that's going to be published this year. It was my MFA thesis and it's gone through, however many iterations. And the chapbook started as something on the side totally unrelated to it because I wanted a place where I could have fun, because the full length felt solemn and like it had to have specific tonalities and specific subject matters. And that closed off other things that I wanted to do things that are a little bit zanier, a little bit more provocative. And so what became the chapbook was just this kind of like little pet personal project to get some extra energies out. And then it kind of did the thing that you were talking about, Ananda, where it then kind of helped me focus some of the themes and some more of the narrative consistencies and some of the things that I was really concerned about. And so it eventually kind of got subsumed by the full length and helped create more structure internally in the full length. So I think it's really interesting to think of the different ways that this can happen. But I want to hear your adjacent point too.
I was going to say, what's interesting, it's for your point too, like there was something kind of more fun about the chapbook process because it almost felt like you didn't know what the expectations were. And so you just were kind of like having fun for some, because the big book's like, this is the big book, And I just wanted to add to that point of going the chapbook, whether you're going backwards, forwards, sideways, whatever with it. Oftentimes we're so used to seeing our poems in our Microsoft Word frame world. It was such a huge thing to me when Ross sent me my first mock-up of my book, where there's certain poems you're like, this is always one page, and then you put it, I don't know the design terms or whatever. They put it in the little Adobe thing, and you're like, this poem is on 2 pages, and you're like looking at it, and it looks so. But even going through those small processes, or having the object and giving your first reading with the book, and going through all those like kind of on a smaller kind of level, to me was such an added boost when I got to the big book process. And our knowing, I think a lot of us feel like everything has to be perfect done when you send it into these contests, knowing like, no, I probably went through 4 or 5 different rounds. I'd love to hear how that went with all of y'all, with Ross. And he was such a great editor to work with. And like, it was my first time, he was like, just stat what you want. And I was like, what does stat mean? Like that was my first time that this is you're entering a conversation with an editor, and to have that on a smaller package with 20, 15, 20 poems, to get that kind of like, not every editor is like Ross. Ross is amazing. So I'm not saying this will always happen with all the presses. I've heard some other stories from other presses, whatever. But typically, I think that's how the process, should go. And so I think for me, that was really beneficial when I got to the big book. That honestly, I think I felt less pressure that it had to be this perfect, beautiful object that I was so attached to, because I had gone through that process with Ross. I don't know if that is similar to something y'all went through.
Yeah, does that help? Ananda or Dan, did y'all feel that way too? Like you were a little freer, less pressure, you could kind of do what you wanted in the chapbooks, where like the full length is like, I've got to like deliver because it's my big first footstep or whatever.
What about you, Ananda?
So so for me, because I think I'm thinking about it, hearing everybody now, I think that my sprawling thing and the have fun thing was very different, because I did an MFA for fiction. So I'm doing all this stuff. You know how you said you had the chapbook on the side for fun? I had poetry as a whole as the side thing for fun. So the whole thing was like that. So I think that's where I did that. I think that's why I was so sprawling. I wasn't talking about my poems. That's why I was so far from audience. Nobody, I had my secret, not secret, but like nobody knew what I was doing poetry wise. And then in the MFA, I would take some poetry classes, which were amazing. But it really was just a glimpse that people got, you know. So I think both of them were very free at that stage, right? It took me a long time at that stage. But yeah, I didn't have the book. I wasn't thinking, I didn't have as many expectations because nobody was seeing the thing and I wasn't doing classes. But editing, yeah, so on the, I forgot what the thing was about editing. But this, the first chapbook that turned into the big book that is coming out this year, um I think these poems lived much longer before they made it into a chapbook, and they were published much longer. They were sort of a little bit more uh, solid, you know, like they had been living for a long time. So there was editing, but there was less editing. And this one with Ross, right, and the team there was amazing. Bull City Press. There was more editors working on it, and there was more attention. There were more people involved, and I thought that was very, very helpful for the big book that I'm writing next, because they would ask me about little things that are like, oh, I remember one was like a very simple thing. There was a march, the word march, I had it not capitalized, and they said, oh, do you want this capitalized? I was like, no, 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 because it's going to tie into all this other stuff that is outside of this book. I'm like, oh, that's a thing. So having that editing process really helped understand what I had here that belong to the other book as well that I'm working on. So yeah, I'm not sure what I answered there, but I answered something hopefully.
No, I think that for me too, it was so much more fun. I think that I was just out of my MFA, and I don't know if that was the same for either of you, or like what stage you were at when you did this. But I was like, you know, just moving out of my MFA, and I was adjuncting, and so I didn't have any time to edit, to write new poems. So I was just like, okay, I'm, you know, grading 100 papers every 2 weeks. I think instead of giving myself the pressure to write new poems, I will just edit the ones that I have from my thesis. And then that's sort of like how the chapbook emerged. And I think I was just like, well, maybe I'll submit these. But I, like I said before, had very few publications. I didn't have any top tier, any like fancy publications yet at all. And so I was just like, no, this isn't going to happen. But I submitted it. And then the first thing I heard back was actually I got a handwritten rejection from Bull City. It was so cute. It was from Noah, and they were just like, "We really love this, but you know, it's not quite there. Like, so send it again later." And that just like, I remember like just carrying that handwritten note around, and like I had it like on my wall in my room, and it was like so important to me because it was the first time anywhere that I considered to be like a really big deal publishing place had ever spoken to me, you know, like it was like this really intense, amazing breakthrough. And that gave me the motivation to submit it to a bunch of chapbook prizes. I didn't know about the PSA because I was just like a baby. I didn't know anything, but I knew I submitted to New Delta Review and the Yemisi Chapbook Prize, and it was a finalist at both of those places. And like Ocean Vuong was the judge for the Yemisi Prize, and I was just like, what is happening? Like, it was like the first time I had ever had any recognition aside from getting into an MFA program, really. So for me, it was like, I look back on how dramatically that changed my idea of myself. Like, it was like, you know, from that note on, I felt so much different. Like, it was like writing totally by yourself to feeling like in community suddenly. So that was really special, and it was so fun. And then I think afterwards, like when I was, you know, touring the chapbook, that was really fun. And I think that the when it stopped being fun was like the fear of feeling like I need to get a job and I need to publish a book, and what do I have to do to get that to happen, you know, and all the money submitting to the contest that, oh my gosh, it's, you know, that's a lot less fun. But the chapbook, it's just like a really wonderful time. I think it's like a really one of my favorite parts of my writing life so far, and I really credit a lot of that excitement to Ross and Noah for that note. And they sent me 2 free chapbooks also with that note, which was a huge deal for me because I couldn't buy anything back then. So
I love how this is turning into like a love letter to Bull City Press, which, yeah, totally here for that. But it's so interesting to think of like, how the chapbook operates in these ways that are, they kind of unfetter us in some ways from our own expectations for ourselves, so that we can kind of write without an audience that doesn't even exist, kind of breathing down our necks that we're trying to satisfy. And then also gives us this kind of tailwind to make it through to the next stage, because oh my God, it's expensive and it's terrifying and it's serious. It feels like so many things are on the line. So yeah.
Can I just say a very quick thing about, just because we've been talking so much about chapbooks and fun. As a reader, I think chapbooks are so fun. I just love chapbooks as things that exist, like the big publishers, because I write fiction, right? I'm sort of in my writer awareness, all the books are in there, the big blockbuster books, and I'm like, chapbooks, none of these big presses, like not like gigantic multinational presses, publish chapbooks. It's just such a beautiful small little thing, and people play with it, and there's less commercial pressure. So I have lots of chapbooks, and as a reader, I see that playfulness and that fun in chapbooks that reflects what you're saying as writers. So just wanted to say that.
I also just want to say a quick thing about personal rejections. A lot of people look at those as not a big, that's a really big deal that someone took the time, and especially to do a handwritten note. And I'm so happy you brought that up, Tina, because I've heard people complain that they didn't win the big prize. If you got a personal rejection, whether it's for an individual submission or for a chapbook or for a big prize, these presses, and I've been from a small reader to a judge, the fact that someone took the time to do that for you is a really big thing. And it's also a sign that you're getting closer. And I love that quote from Sylvia Plath. I'm going to paraphrase it, but she was like, I love my rejection letters. They're signs that I tried. But I love that you carried around that with you, Tatum, as like a totem of like, I'm getting close. I think, and like that does something to your identity. And so if you get a PR in any way, like think that it's just like a really like magical sparkle thing of just like, keep trying, keep going. Like someone took the time to do that because they have so many submissions. And if someone, I think those mean a lot. And I think they don't get talked about a lot.
I'm really glad you kind of reinforced that point, Tiana, because you're absolutely right. And I think that this touches on, imposter syndrome, which I'm sure all of us have felt if we're not still feeling it. I know I still do, even though, we're very fortunate to have had the time that we've spent working on our craft, getting opportunities, and, really taking advantage of those. But it's so weird being a poet when it feels like that has to be a constant verb, right? And if you're not poeming or poeting, you're not it at all. And that imposter syndrome comes through so quickly, so easily. But these personal rejections can remind us that we're on that path and we're doing that work. And I don't know about how y'all feel about this, and this might be a little bit tangential to the conversation, but there's something about just continuing at the work, right? Receiving these rejections because you're trying. Because I did the same thing that you were talking about, Tiana, using deadlines as a means of just enforcing myself to do something. Whether or not it's good, it's just that I need to move it forward. And we can talk about talent and, the muses coming down and anointing our foreheads and anuses or whatever, but it's all about being there and putting the effort in over time, right? And whatever you can take to, kind of put fuel in the tank to keep doing it when you're feeling exhausted, like that handwritten note from Noah, that those are so valuable. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just want to say about imposter syndrome. One thing my professor told me at Vanderbilt that really helped me with that, my professor, Mark Jarman, he said, I told him I was like struggling with that. And here he was like this, grand professor, all these books. And he was like, you'll have that for the rest of your life. He said it very like matter of factly. And for some reason that was so comforting. I was like, oh, like this is not something to overcome, or that the fact that I'm feeling it actually is very much in line with being a writer. And that once I realized that it was kind of like insurmountable, I was like, oh, I got this. You know what I mean? Like, and for me, I alchemized that energy. You know what I mean? Like, that sense of nervousness or that feel of like not being enough. I think if anything, and I try to tell this to myself and to my students, I'm trying more and more to be myself on the page, right? Sometimes my poems and my books are a lot braver than I am in real life. And more than anything, I'm trying to match. And you know, my newest collection, there's this kind of lyric swagger that I'm like, who is she? So it's fun to even inhabit those personas that we may not face in our own life, but you know, it's that asymptote, right? Like we're going to try, we may never touch, but just even reaching for that in our work, reaching for the unattainable feels like a type of triumph most days. So yeah, but doing the work, you know, I look at submitting as a rite of passage, you know, collecting, I mean, you know, we all have the first book things that we want to do. Like everyone's looking at the APR, you know, the Hanukkah, the what's the big one out of poets.org? You know, there's always like the big three, you know, and for me, it's like, all right, you kind of have your first big round of kind of going through those things. And, you know, I felt like that was just part of the rite of passage of kind of like being a writer, going through those rounds. And I know for a lot of people, it takes a lot of years. So, you know, I know a lot of us are very fortunate that happened in a very quick time span for us. And so I don't want to diminish that, you know, some people do these things for many, many years. I also wanted to say very quickly, there was something that happened for me in my chapbook that I published some poems that looking back, and I'm glad that I kept them in my chapbook, that looking back, I'm like, oh, I would never have put those in my first book for me personally. But it's so interesting because like when you fall in love with a poet, I don't know if y'all have done this, I get all of their books and sometimes I like to read from the start all the way to where they are now. And, you know, I won't name names, but there's a poet I love and I went back to her first book and I was like, oh, you know, like, I was like, I saw it gave me permission is going back to imposter syndrome. I saw the maturation process. Like she could not get to book 3 and 4, which I adore, if there wasn't that first book. And that first book, and it wasn't like the first book was like crap, but I was like, okay, you know what I mean? But it gave me permission that like each book teaches me how to write the next book. My chapbook taught me how to write the first book. And it also gives me permission that I don't have to be perfect. I'm actually working against legacy and mastery that like, you look at, for example, Ross Gay's Catalog of Unabashed Gratitude, that's book 3 for him. His other 2 books are great, but there's something special about book 3, special, same thing for Ada Limon, Bright Dead Things. Like that was her, I think it's her 3rd or 4th book. Like you're giving yourself permission, you know, I think I talked to Ross Gay one time about like, he called it like, I asked him, what do you look for in a book contest? And he was like, I'm looking for broken shit. I'm looking for a poet that is taking a risk and doing something that's not so curated and so perfect that they're actually, and me as a judge, I look for that too. So I've lost my train of thought, but I just wanted to share that. Goodbye.
I love how we go. Yeah, I just that was awesome. Yeah, I just wanted to say also something that both Conor and Tiana mentioned before on submission and revision and using submissions as a thing in your writing process, a deadline or whatever. That is very true for me too. And I think I find that the revisions I do before deadline is so much better than the ones I've been doing for months because it becomes so real. And I'm like, that's when the audience comes in, I think. I'm like, okay, let's be honest about this line here that you are keeping. And then you think of, you sort of makes it easier to imagine other eyes reading that as I'm very close to a deadline. And it's happened before because, you know, life and disorganization that I'm like editing like the last minute, you know, for a deadline. And I see the submittable hours getting smaller, you know, 50 minutes, you know, it's going to close in 50 minutes. I'm editing. And there's been many times where I missed the deadline. I'm like, 1 minute after, I'm like, it's ready. I'm going to send it. And then it's like closed. But it was such a great submission, you know, it was like such an intense 3 hours or 2 hours or whatever that I have been trying to do for like months. But it really works, like the submissions really work for me. Another thing that I wanted to say about that mixes some of the things that we've been talking about is before imposter syndrome and all this stuff and submissions. It's not like I know everybody, but like now that I know more people, it's harder for me to submit. Like before I was like, you know, this person does not know who I am. They're not gonna see me. They're not gonna know who I am when I see them. But like if I know the editor, which now I know some of the editors and the people from places I published. I'm like, should I send it? Because they actually know who I am. So embarrassing. That's a big time when the imposter syndrome hits too. It's right before submission, especially if I think the person might know or might remember. And then I'm like, what kind of very bad thing do I have in there? So it's both productive but also scary right before that submission. Even if I end up not submitting, I have to wrestle with both things, the positive side of it and the negative side of it.
I just want to say that I'm envious that your best revisions come right before you submit, because mine always come right after.
Yes, I think that's more accurate.
Well, I think that this is probably a good place for us to wrap up. It's been such a wonderful conversation, and I know that we could go. There's so much wisdom to fathom here with all of you, and I'm so grateful to all of you for the work that you do, continuing to make great poems, continuing to push yourselves and the rest of us as readers of your work too, right? Because those risks that you're taking between chapbook to book, from book to book, from poem to poem, they help authorize so many of the rest of us to do things that maybe have not been done or have not been done this way, or which is we on our own haven't done either. And we need that. So I want to say thank you on behalf of just myself, but all the rest of us who read and love your work. And yeah, I hope that whoever is watching this has enjoyed it as much as I have, as much as we have, and that you get as much value out of it as I have too.
Conor, can I add one little point before we send off? I just want to say this book, Ordering the Storm, How to Put Together a Book of Poems, I highly, highly suggest. I always have my thesis students read this book. It's a book of essays, just about putting together, I like to quick and dirty tips on the way out. So I roll. Highly suggest it. Also, another thing that really helped me really quickly, think about your favorite collection of poems or favorite book of poems. There's probably only 5 or 6 poems that come to your head. You're not thinking about the whole collection. If you have 5 to 6 fire poems, you're ready to go. Don't overthink it. Okay. And also, as now that I've been a judge, it's just really important. I feel like I need to get that stress. Everything though, even though you have 5 to 6 poems, make sure everything looks beautiful and perfect. It starts from the table of contents. Those are like little chapter novels. And it always makes me so upset when I'm judging. I'm sure all of y'all can see there's a messy table of contents or pages are off or things are, I know those are like little nitpicky things, but make sure your book looks perfect and that you're spending the time to do that. That's like, it's like the walking into the foyer, and if things are like messy and cluttery, no shame or judgment in people's personal lives, but don't have your books be like that. Thank you so much, Conor, and to Ananda and Taneum. I don't know, that was how I wanted to leave this. But.
I love it. It's like the broken shit is not like the front matter. Like leave the broken shit for your ambitious that has not achieved it, but like make the shit look good.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Colin.